Preserve geometry. In this video, we'll navigate to the Generative Design workspace and we'll select Preserve Regions. In Fusion 360, we'll get started with the supplied dataset Generative Design Geometry Setup. This contains several different components, including a set of wheels, a rear shock, motor, front suspension, even handlebars and a headlight. We're going to be using these to help us design a generative design frame in Fusion 360. So to get started, we first want to navigate to the Generative Design workspace. It's important to note that in this course, you should already be comfortable with creating basic sketch entities, creating solid bodies, and simply working in Fusion 360. What we want to do from here is we want to take a look at what we can use as preserved geometry for our frame. Now, luckily, this design already contains a handful of things for us. So let's get started by first looking at the browser in a generative design study, so that way we can understand what types of things that we can select, what types of things that we need to avoid, and then also various options that we have that the software provides us. First, when we look inside of our generative model, inside of the study, we see that we have a preserved geometry, an obstacle geometry, an obstacle offset, a starting shape, an unassigned geometry, and even something called symmetry planes. It is important to note with generative design and with many other functionalities inside of Fusion 360, it's always a good idea to go into the preview features and take a look at what's available. In this case for generative design, you can see that we have die casting as a preview functionality, as well as experimental, generative solvers and features. You can always click Learn More to be directed to the Fusion 360 website and find out more about these offerings. For this example, I'm going to have both of these turned on, and I'm going to select OK. From here, let's talk about selecting preserved geometry. When we take a look at our tools, we have our general study settings, we have Edit Model, which allows us to add or remove geometry, different components and bodies from our design. Then we have something called the Design Space. The design space is going to be where we do our primary work on defining the things that we want to keep and the things that we want to avoid. The things that we want to keep are called our preserved geometry. Now, these different regions are going to be objects, in this case bodies, that are going to be used in the final design. So anytime we want to connect to other geometry, such as the motor or the front end of the motorcycle, we want to make sure that we have that preserved geometry. It is important to note that preserved geometry should be simplified as much as possible. For example, the mounts that we have do not contain any threads, they're not chamfered or filleted, they're simply cylindrical bosses that represent how we're going to mount to the motor. In this case, it is important to note that with this Ducati engine, it is a structural member. So we're simply going to mount the frame to these 4 spots on the motor. We're going to rotate this around. And then the ones down here are actually for the swing arm on the rear. We also need to include the upper mounts for the suspension. And then we want to move on to the front, and we want to include the outside portion of the steering stem. These are going to be the elements that we're going to use to generate our frame. Now, that doesn't mean that we're done with the setup. It just simply means that we'll say OK. And now all of those bodies will be shown in green. If we expand our preserved geometry, you can see that we have 7 bodies, and at any point in time, we can edit that to either add or remove. If we decided that we wanted to include the swing arm mounting positions in our frame design, we could do that as well. For this example, however, we're going to stop at those 7 bodies. When we use the visibility eye icon, we can hide and show those, and notice that the bodies hide, so no new geometry was created. It's simply converting those bodies from something as a model component to something defined as preserved geometry. Once we have those preserves defined, let's make sure that we do save this design before we move on.